And even before we welcome you to this second series for the summer of 2013, we want to make sure you also remember that there's one last one scheduled for August the 13th. We're welcoming a Jesuit tonight, so out of ecclesiastical fairness, we thought it was only right to welcome a Dominican in August. Many of you who are here in the Mashpee area fondly remember Father Ken Gumbert, who's going to come and combine his love for theater and movies and stories with the concept of Catholic imagination, so we hope you'll come forward. Practically, the restrooms are out those hot doors and then to your left, and there are going to be some very thoughtful refreshments served after the conclusion of Father Sheehan's presentation, which should last about 3 hours and 10 minutes, but no longer. We're going to age right before his eyes, I have a feeling tonight. I know I have, since he arrived 57 minutes ago in 13 seconds. I feel older already. But just in case you have forgotten, you are at a talk on spirituality and aging, so welcome. It's good to have you here on behalf of Monsignor Hoy and of Father Tim Goldrick, the parish families of Christ the King here in Mashpee, St. Patrick's in Falmouth, Our Lady of the Assumption in Osterville, and Our Lady of Victory in Centerville. I'm Father Mark Hessian, and we're all very proud to have a sixth summer now of these series for adult enrichment. And we're especially proud of the work that Judy does on our behalf, so much so that by about midnight tonight, I'm not joking, she will have uploaded to the Parish of Christ the King website Father's talk, so you can email your friends who couldn't get here or who are home having champagne and baked stuffed lobster just about now, and tell them to tune in for the 2-hour version after Judy does the edits. But it's superb, and can we show our gratitude to Judy for an extraordinary job in that regard. Judy, just because of Myles', dear friendship with Jim Martin, how many hits have we had on the Jim Martin piece? Over 35,000 hits on the Father Jim Martin piece alone, so you got an awful lot of competition to make up for. Well, at any rate, as a parish priest in Osterville and Centerville, I told my own community over the weekend how important it was to come to a talk on spirituality and aging. And no laughing now, I said that means especially you guys who are in your 30s, 40s, and 50s, as I am in my 50s, because we need this stuff to get ready for aging. What I learned, looking around the crowd tonight, is that age group are already hard of hearing. In Myles Sheehan tonight, we truly have an accomplished physician and an even more accomplished Jesuit and truly a man of the church. He was first trained in his father's tradition as a physician with an expertise in both internal and geriatric medicine. And can you imagine, go figure, after getting a degree in geriatrics, he became a Jesuit. He's been taking care of old men ever since then. In a beautiful way, though, he truly has a hands-on experience of both the provision of extraordinary medical care to people who have served the church over their lifetimes. His degrees, of course, are typically too many to mention tonight, from Thayer Academy at the early beginning of a distinguished academic career to Dartmouth and Dartmouth Medical School, to centers of Jesuit learning, and of course to a fellowship at Harvard in geriatrics. We've got a great speaker for you tonight. He promises one thing with 3 parts, typical Jesuit. You're not going to fall asleep. You're going to be very entertained, and you're going to go home a better person. Would you give a nice, great Cape Cod welcome to Myles?
Thank you very much, Mark. It's wonderful to be back on the Cape. My folks moved from Marshfield in 1974, and then my dad worked at Cape Cod Hospital for a few years, and Betsy Hand is there in the back, and we lived right across from each other off the Craigville Beach Road, so it feels good to be here. My dad passed away in '96, and I moved my mother out to Chicago a couple years after that, and we were looking at Lake Michigan one day, and I said, "Do you like it here?" She goes, "It's nice, but it's not the Cape." And that, in fact, is true. just so I don't embarrass her, I changed really quickly and I still have my white socks on. So she'd say, as Betty would say, the only taste you have is in your mouth. So I've already embarrassed myself that way. But what I'd like to do is to make the slide projector work. There we go. I'm going to do a little bit of my doctor stuff with aging first, and then relate that to the way I look at aging and spirituality. Now, when I used to teach medical students, I was the Senior Associate Dean for the medical school at Loyola University in Chicago. And so what I would talk to them about aging is to say, this is a marker for diversity. The older people get, the less alike they are. So in my regular practice, when I'd see a bunch of people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, I could sort of predict what I needed to do and basically what I'd be seeing. When I'd see people in their 70s, 80s, or 90s, I could have someone who is no longer really with it, or I could have somebody who is very, very sharp and healthy. I caused a fair amount of consternation because I did a lot of work with palliative care and end-of-life care, and I was known for not being overly aggressive. However, one of my patients was a 96-year-old lady, and I sent her for a total knee replacement. I danced with her at her 100th birthday. And she was a filthy dancer, the thing, you know, no. And then she made it to 103. And so, you know, and the reason why I did that was because she was completely with it, she was doing fine, and she was in so much pain, I knew with her other stuff that to give her some of the pain medicine would make her goofy. So we went through that. So the older people get, the less alike they are. So chronologic age, it's sort of a common sense thing. As my dad, he was reading the Cape Cod Times one day, and I think this is back in the 80s. And he has the paper up and he crumples, he goes, "Oh, for crying out loud." That's not quite what he said, but he said that. And I said, "What's wrong with you?" And he said, "I'm reading the obituaries." I said, "Are you there?" He goes, "Careful, I'll change my will." And then so I said, "What's wrong with you?" And it goes, "James Smith, 98, dies unexpectedly." I said, "Suddenly, yes. Unexpectedly, no." Now, what are some of the things, since again, when I was working with medical students in their 20s, and I think sometimes when you're speaking to your grandchildren, I know that my medical students didn't think of their grandparents as older. I said, "Well, they're in their 70s. And they go, "Oh, that's different." And what they understood was that most people, as I call, most elderly are free-range elderly. You're not caged, okay? You're allowed to run around more or less, okay? Of those 65 to 74, just a trivial amount are in a skilled nursing facility. It really only goes up with those over 85, sorry, with those over 85. Most older people care for themselves. And again, the reason why somebody ends up needing skilled care is because they can't bathe, dress themselves, feed themselves, use the toilet, that kind of stuff. Otherwise, people are free. Now, medically, I'm going to go through a couple things, but I'm also going to want you to say that this is the same thing I find about spirituality in older people. It's variable. It has extrinsic and intrinsic determinants. It's risky, and it's modifiable. What do I mean about this medically? Well, it's very hard to tell what is due to aging and what can be a disease. Let me tell you another story that's a little silly. 95-year-old lady, not a particularly nice 95-year-old lady, not the lady who I fixed her knee. A friend of mine was seeing her, and he was a geriatric rheumatologist, a specialist of arthritis in old people, and she had what's called osteoarthritis, degenerative joint disease, in one knee, and she was pretty uncomfortable, so he tried one thing with it and said, "Come back and see me in a month." So she came back a month, she said, "It's not working." Tried something else, came back another month, "It's not working." Comes back a third time. And she's pretty bad. She goes, "This is the third time I've seen you. I keep on getting those things from Medicare that say this is not a bill, but it sure looks like you're getting one big hell of a bill ready for me. So what's going on with all this?" And he got exasperated. He goes, "Look, you're 95 years old. What do you expect?" And she goes, "My left knee is 95 and it feels fine." So that's the point. What's due to age and what's due to something else? What about extrinsic and intrinsic determinants? Well, everybody knows a big thing that we get concerned about these days is diabetes in older people. And that kind of diabetes is type 2. You might need insulin, but chances are you're going to get by with pills. Some people have a strong genetic predisposition for that. That's the intrinsic determinant. But the extrinsic is how big you are and how much you eat and how much you exercise. So some people can, if they were to let themselves go, would be frankly diabetic. And otherwise, if they're careful with their diet and exercise, they're not diabetic. So again, that's that extrinsic and intrinsic determinants. What about risky? The reason why like a very healthy 95-year-old person who gets like a pneumonia does poorly is because all the reserve that you'd find in a young kid is gone. So the ability, if you think about the way we walk through life as we're sort of on a tightrope, and so we get infections and we get various problems and different things, it's a little bit like dodging the dodgeball. We might be very good at it, but it's going to be a heck of a lot easier when we're older to get knocked off that rope of life. So that's the risky part of it. And what about modifiable? Well, just look at this room. So again, when I entered the Jesuits in 1985, I was 29 years old. Out at Campion Center in Weston, Massachusetts, where we have our cemetery, people died in their late 60s. Now I have a guy who's 102, and most of my guys die in their late 80s and early 90s. Something has changed, and part of those things that are changing is not only due to doctor stuff. In fact, it's due to people taking better care of themselves with blood pressure control, a moderate amount of exercise. People don't smoke the way they used to. I was thinking the other day about being a little boy, and one of my earliest memories is being just over people's knees, and there was a cloud of smoke in the room, and I kept on ducking under so I could breathe. So again, there are a whole bunch of different things that we can do. So aging isn't a disease. It's a universal process. There are a lot of things that happen along the way. It's hard for us to separate it out. Now, what's that have to do with spirituality? I'm going to talk more about that, but I'd like you to think about it. And here's the thing that I want to have respect. To talk about aging and spirituality, there is no one size that fits all, because you are a very diverse group of people with a diverse set of experiences. And so for me to say, oh, here's how older people should pray, you say, thank you very much, Father. Shove it. Right? You're not going to be pleased with that. And what is it that people mean? Spirituality is a big word these days, and it's a very hard word to define. People use it to mean things like meaning or transcendence or the deepest sense of what it means to be a person. Spirituality comes up with those tough times in life, how you deal with suffering. Spirituality is associated with faith and religion, but it can be distinct. A lot of people will tell me I'm spiritual but not religious. Okay, I get that. I think the converse, it's okay to be religious and spiritual too. You know, I do know people who are very religious and not remotely spiritual, but I'm kidding. But again, those are some of the things. And how, when we think about spirituality, what are the things to think about? Well, if spirituality is about meaning, religion is sort of a formal meaning set with its own symbols, its practices, its rituals that provides those who take part in that religion, hopefully, some meaning. Faith can be something more personal, one's understanding of what are the most important truths about God, or however you look at things. Did you know women are different than men? Up in Boston, we have two different groups that work with, so we have principle-centered leadership, and we got a lot of these big corporate types who come there on the first Friday of the month. And I can talk, and it is like, it's like asking your 14-year-old boy, what happened today? Nothing. So, you know, you try, and you can tell that, but they're not going to talk. With Ignatian conversations with women, I'll go, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Men are different than women. Culture and ethnicity. Obviously, my spiritual experience is deeply shaped by being Boston Irish. There's nothing more fun than a wake. you know? But obviously, my experience is different than an African-American Baptist, or I trained at the Beth Israel Hospital than all my Jewish friends. We have different things that are related to faith, but also have to do with how we grew up and the culture that shaped us. Now, when you think about getting a little bit of treadwear on yourself that you get when you get to be 60, 70, 80, you have an extraordinary amount of experience to look at. And that experience is a source for both meaning and uncertainty and dissonance. And one of the things with spirituality and aging that's risky is how do you put it together as you get older? Does your life make some sort of sense? I don't mean perfect sense, but can you say, I did this well, I did this bad. I was a real stinker in that one. There are ways in which I need to forgive myself, I need to forgive others. Can you pull that off? And that's a hard task. It's not as easy as it sounds. And frankly, it requires this thing called grace. It requires this opportunity to allow God to enter into your life. I must say, I have found it a universal phenomenon, what's labeled Irish Alzheimer's disease. Do you know what that is? Forget everything but the grudges. Do you know what it's like when you're at someone's deathbed and they say, I can't believe she took the china from my grandmother's credenza. It's a little bit like when Voltaire was dying and a Jesuit was called to his bedside and he said, you know, do you renounce Satan? And he said, Father, really now is not the time to make any new enemies. So again, I think the point should be, how do you deal with those crazy grudges? How do you look at those ways in which, you know, you folks, you knew World War II, you knew Korea, you knew ups and downs. There's been good stuff and there's been bad stuff. My folks used to say they were really lucky. And one of the things that really made me angry about Alzheimer's disease is they had like a second honeymoon when they were in their 70s. And they really were happy with each other. And they were very clear that if divorce were part of their vocabulary, they never would have stayed married. That also meant there was a whole lot of stuff that went on that was hard that they had to work through with that. So, when we talk about spirituality, there's a variety of ways in which people are spiritual. So there are different kinds of spirituality. So it can be a personal one that's rooted in a larger tradition. So, okay, guess what? I'm a Jesuit. We're followers of St. Ignatius. There's this whole big thing called Ignatian spirituality, which focuses on finding God in all things in the world around us. That's one type of a spirituality. Other people might be, say, look more towards a Benedictine spirituality, which does a lot with reading of Scripture and a particular kind of meditative approach called Lectio Divina, and we'll do a little bit more with that later. It can, again, be part of a tradition. Then other people I know take bits and pieces. And folks sometimes will, a little bit like coming up with a bouquet, will put some flowers together that don't seem to make any sense, but they make sense for that individual. But here's the other thing. Do people have some spirituality as a way they find meaning that is not good? Well, I know a lot of Irish Catholic people who, when they're old, do not believe that God loves them. And I have spent a lot of time working with older people who really don't believe that they can be forgiven for something, usually involving sex, that happened when they were a kid or in their 20s or 30s. And so this whole idea that regrettably is common with some, that God is basically a nasty policeman who's out to get you. A lot of us, that's the tape that we have in our mind. And that's not unique to the Irish, but it is common in people who have come up from an immigrant tradition where there's been a fair amount of suffering along the way. That idea that you can have a basic trust in the meaning of the universe, the meaning of the nature of the universe, that is what we're born with, but it gets all messed up. And what grace does is allow us to sort of recapture that original image, that dream that God has for us, and that takes some work. If you were to think about what I talked about, And actually, I'm going to make you do something in a minute. If you were to think about where it is that you find meaning. So I'd invite you just to relax a little bit. You don't have to lie on the floor or stand on your head or do anything like that, unless you'd like to. But if you were just to briefly think about your life, what would be, say, 2 or 3 big crossroads that happened in it? You married this guy or this woman. You didn't marry that guy or that woman. This happened with a kid, that didn't happen with a kid. Somebody you loved died. Who were the people you met who helped give you advice, who helped you? Who were the people who hurt you? And now, for just a second, shut your eyes. I'm not going to go through your wallets or anything like that. Take a deep breath. And put yourself in the presence of whatever you find holy. I have a very traditional view of that. But I just want you to put yourself in the presence of what you find holy. And think about those crossroads. Those people you met who helped you, those people who hurt you. Just spend 1 minute, and I'll clock it. I mean, it's a long time when you don't expect it, isn't it? Now, I'm not going to ask you to share right now what happened in that. But later on, later this week, some other time, think about maybe what happened, or maybe just think about something that was starting and I opened my big mouth and ruined it for you. But think about what your life looks like. What's the map of your life? And it's not a bad exercise to even take a piece of paper and draw it out. If you were to show that and talk to God about it, or just to draw that map and shut up and sit before God, what is it that you'd feel inside? So how do you understand spirituality? I think basically the basic thing is, how do you relate and find meaning in your life? On a very loose way, could you say an atheist has spirituality? Well, there's some way he or she has to find some meaning, or else they'd cut their throat on any given day. How is it that you find meaning, or not, to the concept of a God? What does that mean for you being who you are, being a human being? And what's the journey you went through? That's why I wanted you to do the map. What is, for instance, why is it that Myles Sheehan at 57, he was a doctor, he's a Jesuit priest, he's done this stuff, he comes from this background. What is the ways in which I've found God in that way? And how have I messed up, done right, all those other things? And how do I understand that meaning? That's what we talk about spirituality. That's not much. Now let's get back to the aging bit. A spiritual life of an aging population is variable. Many people have never done this before. They don't really know. They think Father has to give them permission to do it. The idea that you could have a personal relationship with God. Partly for Catholics, that sounds very Protestant. It sounds a little weird. And it's not, but there's a way in which it's okay. It has extrinsic and intrinsic determinants. Well, the extrinsic stuff is some of the stuff that's happened to you. You know, from my parents' generation, World War II and the Depression were pretty big ways that influenced their spirituality and didn't make it exactly sunshine time, okay? It can be risky because as you look at your life, the challenge sometimes to find peace where there's been some real brokenness can be very hard. And it's also modifiable. God is interested in you. That's sort of one of my basics. And God can work with you to allow your sense of meaning and how you view the story of your life to change. You can view it that I'm not a really good person or God's a jerk, to change it to I've done good and bad and I've been deeply loved. You can't do that on your own, but God can assist you with that. There are spiritualities that are sort of evasive. You know, there was a book on aging and spirituality that I thought was really stupid because it said we're not going to talk about decline or problems with memory or death. Well, it's like, I'm going to write a book about adolescence, but let's not mention puberty. You know, I mean, those are, and other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, did you enjoy the show? Guess what? A big part of your spirituality when you're old is, I forget my keys twice a day. Give it 20 years from now, and I'll be terrified. As my mother would say, you know, I don't know anybody anymore. Everybody I liked is dead. Those are things that influence how you find where you are in the world. What is it then the person you really loved the most in your life, or the person maybe who wasn't the one you loved your most in your life but you spent your whole life with? What happens when he or she dies? Betsy Handwell liked this one. 5 years after my dad died, I was driving with my mother, and I said, gosh, Mama, can you believe it? Daddy's been gone 5 years. And she said, oh, I miss him so much. I said, he used to fight like cats and dogs. She goes, the longer he's gone, the better he looks. Now, that was their relationship. My dad would have liked that, actually. So, but again, the search for meaning and relationship usually has to undergo the risk of dealing with all the things in your life that would tell you there isn't any of those things. Now, let me give you some presumptions now that I'm almost halfway into the talk. I figure most of you are Catholic, otherwise you'd be at the Melody Tent this night. Okay? And here's the thing that I find, a lot of people have been taught prayers, but they're very confused about what it means to pray. And we can just do a little. You wonder if spirituality is more than devotions. So I know many good people who will, and there's nothing wrong with devotions, but they will multiply rosaries, saying the Stations of the Cross, doing this, that, or the other thing, you know, going to Mass, doing that stuff. Those are all good things. But sometimes people, gee, is there a way to ground this more? The other part, what is a universal thing I hear from people maybe 20 years older than I, you are really upset about your kids and grandkids and they don't go to church. And you sent them to Catholic school, and you sent them to Boston College, and you did all this, and they are actually very nice people, but pagans. They rarely barbecue missionaries in their front yard, but if I tried, I might end up on the grill, you know? And that's a real ache, that the ways in which you've found the most meaning in your life and really worked hard to transmit are all messed up. And guess what? You're probably furious about some of your experiences in the church. I was very lucky that even as a little boy, I can remember we on Sunday at dinner used to have to discuss the homily. And there was a priest when I grew up, and all he used to do was scream about communism. I was like 3 or 4. And I remember my brother and sister were there, and so there's Ty and go, Mama? Yeah. Is Stalin God? And they go, and my dad goes, where the hell did that one come from? And I said, Father Murphy, all he does is scream about Stalin. It's Jesus and Mary and Stalin. Do you remember? And then the other part is, you know, when I hear confessions, I'm just stunned that people are really surprised that I'm nice. You know, I put 3 tokens into the streetcar. Oh, well, this is a very serious matter. You're clearly going to hell. I had a dirty thought. Share it with me. Me too. And then people will also tell you about the stuff that's amazing, that really is horribly painful, and in which, yeah, there's wrong, there's sin, but there's also so much love and grace. I was really lucky to have that experience most of the time I was growing up. But I know many people haven't. And you know what? The business with the abuse. I mean, when this stuff became public, I felt like my grandmother was selling crack cocaine or something like that. And all I can tell you is being provincial, I'm cleaning up old messes from 20 years ago. And it's very, very painful, and it's sort of unbelievable. And it makes you wonder, what's the truth of all this stuff? You know, it all seems like sort of a group of guys get together and they probably start off with good ideals, but then they end up acting sort of weird. And there are a lot of good priests, but there are a lot of people who are a little squishy, and those folks have terrorized some of you. One of the things that I get crazy about is people say, well, and here's the part. We have 24-hour news coverage 365 days a year. There are 18,000 bishops in the world. What is the chance that in a 24-hour cycle, 18,000 men, one of them won't say something stupid? You never heard about the stuff before. And the other part is, having studied church history, quite honestly, this is probably one of the best times in terms of integrity since the church started. That doesn't mean that the church isn't horribly sinful in its human expectations. People go, I'm going to leave the church because of this. I go, okay, you've got to separate yourself from Christ. You're not going to receive the sacraments. And you've got to sit away. So you've got to give more power to the jerks rather than allowing yourself to be with all of us so we can celebrate the Eucharist together and find God. That's a good idea. Let's make sure the jerks win. It's like saying, I love to play baseball so much, I'm going to take my glove and ball and I'm not going to play with you. It doesn't make sense. What does make sense, though, is the pain. Now, spirituality is often about finding meaning. And can I just do something with you for a minute? Quick, have a picture. It's a Jesuit with a rosary, okay? About 3 weeks before my mother died, she was very quiet, and I was sitting next to her bed saying the rosary, and I got to the third something or another mystery, and she sat up and she goes, I've always hated the rosary. Is that a problem? And I said, how do you feel about Mary? And she goes, Mary's fine. The rosary I can't take. And then she goes, would you shut up? I go, okay. And part of the thing was, and one of the things that was hard for me was, I loved Cardinal Cushing, but what I call the auctioneer style of praying. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is written. Amen. Imagine when you say the rosary, you think of, okay, the first joyful mystery. It's hilarious to try to get my medical students to come up with the mysteries and stuff like that. Mary finds a sale at Bloomingdale's. I go, shut up, that's not the mystery.